Hello, I'm James Conlon, and welcome to this talk about Giacomo Puccini's opera, Madame Butterfly. Un bel dì is one of the most popular arias from an Italian opera that entered the repertory 120 years ago and has remained there ever since. The protagonist is named Cho-Cho-san. By the second act, she awaits her husband, an American naval officer named Benjamin Franklin Pinkerton, to return to her in Nagasaki. His arrival, after a 3-year absence, will result in the catastrophic end of Giacomo Puccini's opera. Madame Butterfly is the last of 3 nearly perfect operas from what might be termed Puccini's middle period. A musical, theatrical, dramatic, and psychological high point in the composer's compositional life. It is a melodrama which ends tragically, the result of the total contradiction of how Cho-Cho-san and Pinkerton view marriage. The opera is one of the most sophisticated character studies in Puccini's output. Cho-Cho-san is perhaps the only of his heroines who truly fulfills a part of the ancient Greek model in that her death is not the result of chance or accidental circumstances. The entire opera plays out in a single setting, a house on a hill overlooking the city and the port of Nagasaki. That house has a musical motive, and it sets the drama in energetic motion. The melodrama is intimate. By arrangement, Cho-Cho-san marries Pinkerton. She takes it very seriously, a lifelong love. He does not. He looks upon it as a passing amusement during his relatively short stay in Japan. That clash is the crux of the tragedy. The principal characters have Wagnerian-type musical motives. Cho-Cho-san has several. They are beautifully romantic and deeply evocative, giving her a sympathetic and loving aura from her first appearance. There are 3, and they are connected together. They introduce her as she appears with her family on her wedding day. Here is the first one. This motive is transformed in a moment of high drama in Act 2, when the now abandoned Cho-Cho-san shows her son to the American Consul General, whose name is Sharpless. Here is her second motive. And here is her third motive. After we have heard these 3 motives, which will return in various modes during the rest of the opera, her entrance scene will be complete. At the end of the first act, the same series of motives and passages will bring the so-called love duet to a great climax, as the marriage is about to be consummated. Pinkerton's music is lighthearted, winning, full of sunshine, and handsome. Purposefully, none of it reflects his faults. He does not have a continuous motive, but slightly chameleon-like. His music, in a way similar to Mozart's Don Giovanni, reacts to the situation rather than defines it. As an example, Pinkerton proposes a toast to the Consul General. There is an unsubtle quotation of the Star-Spangled Banner. His inner character, to the degree that he has any, has allowed many interpretations. The adjectives are copious: narcissist, male chauvinist, imperialist, for starters. Some see a strong anti-American view in this opera. One Marxist perspective from a 1950s Eastern European production claimed, quote, Puccini had been a realist, belonging to a movement which mirrored the hard life of the people, though he was unable to understand the laws of class struggle, unquote. If so, there is an irony. The original authors were John Luther Long and David Belasco. Belasco, a very colorful figure that deserves more attention than we can give him here, was also responsible for Puccini's next major opera, La Fanciulla del West, The Girl of the Golden West, which was premiered at the Metropolitan Opera in 1910. The reportedly true story of Madame Butterfly reached the attention of the original authors through the diplomatic world. In fact, one source claims that the male protagonist was an officer of the Tsarist Russian Imperial Navy. Puccini saw the play in London. Despite the fact that he spoke virtually no English at all, he was moved to tears and he immediately saw the latent possibilities of his next opera. I would assert that Puccini was not ideological in the slightest, and that his operas are totally apolitical. That the American naval officer reflects quote-unquote imperialistic behavior is doubtlessly true, but that Puccini had any interest in promoting that or any analysis of history or society is not supported by any biographical evidence, conversations, or writings. Pinkerton doesn't have an individual musical motive. His person lacks character or real substance, but he is presented as attractive, winning, and carefree, which he indeed is in Act 1. Suzuki is Cho-Cho-san's faithful servant companion. She is introduced with the other servants with great delicacy. And of equal importance, the American Consul General, Sharpless, a good-hearted and earnest diplomat who warns and admonishes the young naval officer not to treat the marriage lightly. Unfortunately, Pinkerton only understands this, to his great remorse, at the end of the opera. Here is Sharpless, his motive open, wide intervals, generous and kind. Then there is Goro. The most polite term for him would be marriage broker. He arranges the wedding, which is non-binding for Pinkerton, and subsequently, understanding the impending catastrophe for Cho-Cho-san, tries to arrange another marriage to the wealthy prince Yamadori. Goro, like Pinkerton, has an elastic musical personality instead of a single defined musical motive. He is obsequious, as demonstrated by the music that accompanies his first entrance.
Quando vengono a prova la norma che vi giova, nello stesso locale, alternar nuovi aspetti al consueti.
He is self-interested and transactional. In short, in the business of selling. His music is often high energy, as when he announces the arrival of the wedding guests.
Son giunte al sommo del pentio, già che il femmineo sciame qual divento incolpiame, so del brusio.
The Prince Yamadori is given music of Wagnerian Tristanesque proportions, dramatically inexplicable unless interpreted as Cho-Cho-san's mockery of his wooing, or again, by Puccini's inner love for the protagonist. Tragedy, to the ancient Greeks, implied either defiance of the gods, hubris, or falling from a great height, or a fatal flaw. The height from which Cho-Cho-san falls is not that of temporal power, but a metaphoric one, that of a supreme virtuous humanity. If she has a flaw, it is credulity or blind faith. She sees no other course of action when faced with a choice among abandonment, returning to the life of a geisha, or marrying someone she does not love. She sees jigai, a ritual suicide, as the only dignified solution, an honorable death. Her second great aria reflects this, transforming the memory of the geisha's dance to a death march, as a sort of danse macabre. It is hard to name another composer whose entire creative force so rarely deviated from a single focal point. Giacomo Puccini's fascination with women in love was the alpha and omega of his life's work. Not only his operas, his life too was ruled by his attraction and absorption with women. As a composer, he embraced the theater and eschewed absolute music. As a dramatist, he chose the, quote, sufferings of little souls, unquote, his words, over the great, the tragic, the grandiose, or the transcendent. He wrote exclusively about love, death, and erotic romantic desperation. As a man, he was melancholic by character and pessimistic by philosophy. Characteristically, Puccini begins his operas with the initial first half of Act I without any dramatic interaction, but rather as a scene-setting orientation and exposition. This is often accomplished with a high-voltage, energetic opening theme that drives the first part of the opera and to which the composer can refer subsequently. Let's compare that with the opening bars of La Bohème, a theme originally composed as a scherzo for orchestra. Once again, high energy. Let's compare that with the first scene of the next opera, Tosca, which is the outstanding exception to Puccini's normal rule in that we are thrust immediately into the dramatic situation. But there is the same initial energy at the beginning. The form of the introduction is not an overture nor a prelude, which are pieces of symphonic music detached from the first act. It commences with a fugue, a centuries-old form of absolute music, but one which captures the excitement of the wedding day. It has a second theme, which is also extracted often in the course of the rest of the opera, but whose clear identification is difficult to pin down. It is elastic in its uses, but I associate it with the city of Nagasaki, possibly more broadly with Japan, or even just with Goro, the marriage broker. Here's the theme. In general, I am not an adherent of analyzing musical works as a form of composer's psycho-autobiography. That said, viewing Puccini's life and works through this particular lens is more than of passing interest. Why he and not others? On a spectrum of composers, there are those for whom one can make a claim, weaker or stronger, that their personal lives and psyches directly governed their artistic choices. On that spectrum, I would place Puccini at the extreme of those whose works do, in fact, reflect their personal lives and psyches, both in their choice of subjects and the details of the elaboration of those choices. His inexhaustible genius repeatedly dressed up his obsession with women and love in a garb foreign to his audiences, creating an apparent distance from the immediacy of his fixation and in apparent contradiction to the contemporary goals of verismo opera, which concentrated its interest on everyday people and situations, slices of life recognizable by his public. These are ordinary individuals, but always, oddly enough, removed by Puccini from contemporary Italian life. The woman is his protagonist. The love, passion, devotion, desire, jealousy, nostalgia, yearning, and disappointment his various heroines feel and inspire. He writes in the third person, sympathizing with her and her tragedy. Puccini himself, however, is, in my opinion, the secondary protagonist, infusing every drama with his psychological projections. Digging below the surface, plumbing the depths, seeking the hidden source, we can see his often turbulent inner life. The so-called love duet that closes Act 1 and confirms the marriage is amongst the greatest he wrote and is disproportionate to the situation. It is appropriate for Chocho-san, but far too magnificent and deep for Pinkerton's character. We can only interpret it as, one, a reflection of the profundity of Chocho-san's love, though not Pinkerton's, and, or, two, an expression of Puccini's own passion, which finds an ardent outlet in his attraction to his leading lady. Whereas, on the one hand, it rings slightly odd dramatically, it stands at the apex of the conventional genre of Italian love duets and as a piece of music unsurpassed in Puccini's remaining operas. Love and life, lived and lost together, are the elements of melodrama. This common theme is not his exclusive property, of course, nor that of Italian opera. It has found a place throughout classical music's history. But Puccini filters it and distills it in a very personal way. He reveals himself in the process. As in Wagner, musical motives can be places, persons, emotions, and objects. Here are some important ones. Chocho-san's personal effects.
Fazzoletti, la pipa, una cintura, un piccolo fermaio, uno specchio.
Here's a comic one for Chocho-san's relatives.
Qui verrà l'ufficiale del registro, i parenti, il vostro console, la fidanzata. Vi si firma l'atto, il matrimonio è fatto.
The wedding is interrupted by Chocho-san's uncle, who is a bonze, a Buddhist monk. He recounts that she has converted to Christianity, and he loudly calls upon all to curse, reject, and disown her. We will hear two musical motives emerge, which will recur and haunt Chocho-san throughout the rest of the opera. One of them contains a trill, which owes its origin, I believe, to the still omnipresent shadow of the recently deceased Giuseppe Verdi and his opera Otello. whose villain, Iago, is characterized by that very trill. Destiny will recur at dramatic moments subsequently. Here's a motive for the sword. It is the same sword she will use at the end of the opera. The motive is, metaphorically, death, and here it is. Then there's a motive for the hill, which leads from the port of Nagasaki to Cho-Cho-san's house. It is a very simple musical scale, and she imagines, for instance, that someday Pinkerton will walk up that hill. Now, for those writers who might adopt a psychoanalytic point of view, Puccini the man is enmeshed in a complex web of obsession, dependence, and unconscious hostility. Ambivalent feelings of love and hate, tenderness and cruelty toward his female protagonists are dramatized in the arena of his operas. These conflicts are played out repeatedly, but never resolved. That his psyche and art were so inspired and attracted by the woman should come as no surprise. He had grown up in a predominantly feminine environment, strongly attached to his mother, who was widowed when young Giacomo was 5 years old. He had 5 sisters and only 1 younger brother. There is a collection of factors, a syndrome peculiar and specific to the dynamics of Puccini's melodramas. Each soprano wins our sympathy with her beauty, inner, outer, or both, and her ardent love. Each heroine characteristically suffers at the hands of men, society, or fate. The perpetrator's variant character, but not their often villainous effect. The results of Pinkerton's actions are catastrophic. He is essentially a narcissist and reflects a sense of entitlement. He is superficial, and as an American naval officer, is guilty of a certain arrogance and even moral crimes, including bigamy. This story precedes William Lederer and Eugene Burdick's famous novel, The Ugly American, and the Vietnam War by over half a century. Puccini loves each of his heroines with deep empathy, justifying or at least rationalizing whatever faults they may have. The crueler their misfortunes, the more intensely Puccini expresses that suffering in his music. None of this suggests that Puccini's personal philosophy justifies the maltreatment of women, nor advocates for it. His operas stem from drama, from which his music grows. Puccini chose, or in his words, was chosen, to write exclusively for the theater. He said, "I am a man of the theater. I see the characters, the colors, and their gestures. If, alone at home, I don't succeed to see the stage planted in front of me, I don't write. I can't write a note." The emotional underpinnings of his entire output have clear and consistent characteristics. The repetitive and obsessive turbulence of melancholy, desire, psychological cruelty, and romantic catastrophe is the soul of his theater. The psychic similarity to Puccini the man is masked by his compositional and theatrical genius, which is to be found in the inspired and varied portrayal of subjects foreign and distant from his public. Significantly, he was, in contrast to Verdi, an internationalist in his absorption of foreign influences into his music. He seemed to distance the immediacy of his dramas by placing them at a temporal and geographic distance from his audiences. Was he also disguising a virtual sameness of the psychological foundations of inspiration? When Cho-Cho-san reveals the existence of her young son, whose name is Dolore, sadness, it is a magnificent variation on her love motive from her first act entrance. She will wait through the night for Pinkerton's arrival to the port of Nagasaki. She will do so to the strains of the famously exquisite humming chorus, a wordless lullaby similar to a tone painting. It is derived from the General Consul's reading of Pinkerton's letter, in which he tries to explain to Cho-Cho-san that he will return with an American wife. The haunting, calm beauty of her nocturnal vigil is tender and ethereal. The mood is shattered by the orchestra's cataclysmic outburst of the destiny motive, which gives the orchestra full voice to express the inarticulate but powerful tragedy for which the scene is now set. In a partial contradiction to the spirit of the time, in which the Verismo movement encouraged exploring the lives of common people in art, Puccini's quote-unquote little souls, he set not a single drama in contemporary Italy, choosing instead the Black Forest, Flanders, 4 times in Paris, 3 times in Italy in the past, Florence in 1299, an unidentified 17th century convent, and Rome in 1800, the American West, Japan, and ancient China. It must be remembered that the Japan of Madame Butterfly, the ancient China of Turandot, and the America of Fanciulla del West is written through the eyes and ears of an Italian European for a predominantly Italian European public. His natural habitat is the Italian musical syntax of his heritage, now enriched with a degree of Asian musical elements, creating a complex mix of Eastern-Western influences, the revolutionary effects of Wagnerian reforms, and more than an incidental dose of Debussy, and particularly the recent success of Pelléas and Mélisande. We, the inheritors of this extraordinary music, have benefited from Puccini's cosmopolitan personality and his openness to everything going on in the musical world of his time. The motive of the hill is subtly woven into Cho-Cho-san's powerful farewell to her little son. A doleful funereal passage follows, and she prepares her jigai. Pinkerton arrives to the motive of the hill which he has just climbed and calls out her name 3 times. As the 19th century yielded to the 20th, Europe saw the gradual decline of the social and political order, the dissolution of the Belle Époque and the convulsions of the First World War. Puccini, though, seemed to ignore it all and continued to live and write about the power of passion and personal melodrama in an age that was gradually turning away from them. He embodied that tradition and was its preeminent and last great advocate. It virtually passed from the operatic stage with him, the bar perhaps having been raised too high to be equaled. Had the form exhausted itself, having lived, loved, and died? With a shattering dissonance, he leaves the public in a state of shock which is as chilling today as it was in 1904. It concludes this work unconventionally. The dissonance is not earthbound or grounded harmonically, but a disturbing gesture that leaves the listener dangling perilously in the air. Does it say something about Puccini, who will live 20 more years with his own unresolved inner psyche in a state of permanent turmoil? To requote the citation from Il Tabarro, will Puccini the man have lived, loved, and died through love?